and short-term holding facilities, such as the one that you may be familiar with in Palomino Valley. That totals 46,100 wild horses in holding. What gathers are being planned in the near future to address the AML issue? Well, although I did provide a response here, I want to talk a little bit about sequestration. Everyone here, if you're paying attention to the news, you've heard that the federal government is going through a sequestration due to no additional taxes. And what that means to this program is that it received a 5% cut, or $8 million have been taken out of this program. What that means to the program is that, as I mentioned earlier, there will be no census work done this year. The second thing is that all of the gathers that were planned for this summer have now been canceled. So what we expect to happen from that is you can probably add another 20% on top of what's there, on top of that figure of 24,000 to 26,400, and add another 20% on top of that to accommodate this year's full crop. And in looking at those spreadsheets, you should assume that numbers will continue to rise above AML, and there'll probably be a few more herd management areas that will now be above AML. From the Forest Service, what is the current census of wild horses and burros in Nevada? They have quite a few less than the BLM. They have 2,616 wild horses and 438 wild burros. They too are not expecting any gathers this year. So I have a bit of other news in regards to the update. So the Forest Service recently put out a notice on March 5th that they are working with the BLM and at the Hickson Wild Burro Territory, which is kind of in the area of Austin. They are working to consolidate, it's probably the wrong word to use. They are going to join the BLM and the Forest Service wild horse and burro areas into one and expand the area that those animals are using, resulting in a larger area that would accommodate horses and burros. I know that my department will be commenting on this. Another issue that's come out recently is that the BLM put out what's called a drought management plan. And in that plan, they identify triggering mechanisms and monitoring of the range to look at how a drought might affect the land and the management of wild horses and burros. Right now, what the BLM has identified is that the wild horses are moving out of their winter range, and they moved out of there early as a result of a lack of forage and a lack of water. So they are already on their summer range and probably will utilize the water and the forage there to the point where BLM is expecting to have to provide additional watering through water hauls. They'll put out a number of water holding facilities, usually these large troughs, and they'll bring trucks in and water them. That's a pretty expensive operation for them. They are not planning any emergency gathers. As I mentioned, they're even lower on budget than they were last year. So I've directed my staff and staff in the game division to start looking at the conditions for wildlife and what this might mean for them. I would expect that competition with any of our big game species that also utilize grass as their forage, and that would probably be elk, antelope, bighorn sheep, that there would be an increase in competition for forage and certainly an increase in competition for water. That concludes my update. Are there any questions?
I really appreciate the way that this looks. It's easy to read, but it makes it so easy to read. It's disturbing. You know, I'm looking at one in particular, and when I was on the Wildlife Commission before, the Nye County Advisory Board came to us multiple times complaining about the horse numbers on Jefferson Mountain. I'm looking in here, this is 5-6 years later. Estimated population 288, high HML 30. We're 7 times. And that, where those horses are, they're not down the valley and they're not on top where the sheep are. They're right mid-range where our mule deer are. And that's one of my favorite places, and they have pounded the heck out of it, and we just can't get any relief down there. And I know everybody in this room probably has their favorite place that they could tell the same story about, but it's really disheartening to look at the way that this looks, and I don't know what we can do, but I've said it in the past, sitting here complaining about it, all we do is get frustrated, and this just added to my frustration.
So my department reviews every action in regards to wild horses and burros. In addition to that, we bring to the attention of the federal land managing agencies any areas that we feel are hammered. I'll use that term. In other words, areas around water are the soil's completely compacted, the vegetation's gone, the trails where animals move from forage to water are, there's no vegetation there, those areas are widening. But you should know that we don't really receive any response in changes. Here's what I do expect. I expect that the BLM will be reducing the AUMs for livestock. I expect them to be asking for voluntary reductions. I also think that they will change the season of use for livestock, and that includes cattle and sheep. So in order to accommodate the additional horse numbers and the lack of forage and water, the livestock industry will probably be the one to take the hit. What my responsibility is to see that wildlife doesn't take that hit. So we'll be watching very closely.
And in the Taquimas, the sage-grouse have to be taking that hit because that same zone that the horses are is where I hunted sage-grouse as a youth, and that's where I took my son to take his first sage-grouse, and it is just beat up. I mean, it has to have a tremendous impact on the bird. So I'm just frustrated by this thing. I'll get off my soapbox. Commissioner Wallace.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, are these BLM numbers?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. The Department of Wildlife doesn't do any of this census.
Probably double the number and get the true number, because one of my favorite places has way more than 29 horses on it.
Commissioner Rain.
One thing I see on here, you wrote estimated population, when my understanding, because I've been to 1 or 2 meetings, is that it's not an estimated population after all. That should be probably listed as observed population. That's what they actually saw. They don't estimate populations. Can you verify what I'm saying is correct there? That's what they've said every meeting, every time I ever asked them. We cannot extrapolate. We only say what we've seen.
That's true.
Okay. So that's what we're using is these are observed populations. There could very well be 10 times, who knows? You got those treed places. How much did they cover with their surveys? This is what they actually saw. Yeah, how many really are there? Okay.
Every time I see Raul Morales, I tell him I don't like the way he counts.
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, I must have seen, have you seen you up the other? It's one of my favorite mountains. Maybe we,
Commissioner McBeth.
Steve, any update on the Association of Counties threat to do a lawsuit?
I know that Raul did check with, Elmer did check with them, and nothing new.
Commissioner Drew.
Yeah, just to hit on a couple items here that I was going to report under the Public Lands Committee, but this probably is a more appropriate time. I think Mr. Siegel did a really good job of outlining some of the challenges. Some of the things that I bulleted that maybe add to this conversation a little bit is before the sequester and all gathers being suspended, they're actually, I think in his words, we're trying to stay at AML without having to conduct huge gathers. And I said, well, how does that work? Because the math doesn't seem to pencil out in my mind. And he said, essentially what they were looking at doing is staging their gathers. So instead of gathering 1,000 horses in 1 year, maybe they gather several hundred over a series of years, and they target the priority areas. So riparian areas that maybe are hammered, as Steve has said, or sage-grouse areas, things of that nature. It kind of sounds like some of that has gone by the wayside with the budget situation. And of course, budget's always a huge issue. Alan Shepard, who provided the update, said Nevada has 50% of the horses. If we got 50% of the funding, maybe we'd be okay. But he said that the funding allocation doesn't necessarily follow the horse allocation state by state. Their budget's basically being eaten up by long-term holding, which is why they're looking at shifting more to this public land eco-sanctuary concept. And he did provide just a brief update on the Spruce Mountain Eco-Sanctuary. Essentially, BLM's team is working internally to establish a carrying capacity, or their estimate of a carrying capacity for the horses within that proposed eco-sanctuary. And I don't remember that he gave a timeline for when he thought the draft EIS would be out. The only other thing that I had noted, we've talked a long time about, feeling a little bit helpless. He did mention that there is a group, a coalition of conservation groups in DC who have been advocating for following the 71 Act, and also advocating for staying at or getting to AML. And he's supposed to follow up with me and give me the contact information for those folks. So that may be a group we look at corresponding with in the future, and at least getting our policy in their hands and information like that. So I think those were the key points that came out of the meetings, but other commissioners or members of the committee are more than welcome to add on.
Well, maybe I can add a few items. One of the questions that was asked at the meeting was, why isn't the BLM utilizing euthanasia as a tool, even though that's part of the act? And Raul's response was that the money was tied to a prohibition of destroying healthy animals. So this is a point that we had been making in our comments, is that we wanted the BLM to utilize the full range of tools available. Well, that's one tool that is no longer available to the BLM.
Mr. Moray?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The question that I have, and maybe you can answer it, or maybe you can't, but if I recall, you said that due to the 5% cut, there'll be no census conducted and no gathers this coming year.
That's correct.
However, plans are being made, or it is anticipated that they're going to be spending money hauling water out there to these animals. Is this, in your opinion, is this a BLM and a Forest Service management decision, or do you know who makes that decision?
See, the BLM is responsible for providing adequate resources to address health issues for wild horses. In other words, if they're dying of thirst, the BLM is responsible for their health and needs to take action. So hauling water is really the only thing that's available for them to provide adequate water. There's inadequate amount out there. If you ask me where they're going to get the money for that, I can't tell you that. I have no idea.
So so does that fall true if they're starving to death?
Well, I would say that they can live longer without food than they can without water. But are they in poor body condition? Yes. If you track these gathers, you'll see that on every gather that they've had in the past couple of years, they do destroy animals that are in such bad shape. Their skin and bones, you see the ribs sticking out. This is primarily due to inadequate forage. One of the things that Alan told us is that they're probably traveling 15 to 20 miles a day between forage areas and water.
McNitch?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously it's been going on for an awfully long time. And, I'm not sure if there's really ever going to be a solution to really get down to the nuts and bolts of it. But we as a commission might be getting closer and closer to, we can talk about writing our letters to our congressional delegation and expressing our concerns with the sequester and what it's doing in Nevada. We can do all that stuff, but what it boils down to is maybe we need to look into what it's going to take to file our lawsuits or our injunctions or whatever the case may be, and see if we can compel some change that way. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're a horse advocate or a wildlife advocate. The fact of the matter is there's animals out there that are, if they're not suffering already, they're going to be. And my interest is certainly with the wildlife, but you got to have a little compassion for the horses. They're their own worst enemy out there in a lot of ways, and they're not getting any help. We'll help them in every way. We'll make sure to feed you on the range. We'll make sure to water you on the range. Wild animal or not, why? Maybe not through taxpayers' money. I mean, it happens with wildlife, but most of that money's coming from. I don't want to get into that too much. I guess I'm just running through. You remove animals for an emergency gather, you check their health, you get it down below AML, but then you put them back on there because they haven't deteriorated enough to keep them off. Just doesn't make sense. Put them out there so, we'll check you in about 3 months, and when you're a bag of bones, we'll bring you in and do something with you. I don't know.
Dying from dehydration is a very painful death. They are suffering. And what happens with forage is as the more nutritional plants are depleted, they fill their bellies with
Things they can't digest.
cheatgrass. I mean, there's nothing left in those areas. They fill them with non-nutritional items, and they will die of a lack of nutrition, yet probably with a full belly.
Anybody else have any good news? Okay. Well, you have anything else, Steve, or we'll move on?
Well, I would surely recommend some action by this group. I know that Elmer or I come and present these numbers to you almost every month, and I guess I haven't seen any action by this group yet.
I need to check with some people before I go that direction.
But I think it's time. I think it's time. If it's not at least some message to our congressional delegation, then something else. There's a very strong lobby on the East Coast that fights for wild and free roaming horses and burros. If they only knew the conditions that they're in now and what leaving them to multiply does for wildlife, there might be a little bit of a change of mind.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll move on to 21B. Question 1, bond fund update. Steve? I'm sorry. We don't have it listed as public comment informational. Sorry about that, Joel. I'm sorry.
You talking number 24?
Yeah.
Okay, B.
I'm going to have Katie pass out another spreadsheet. So good afternoon again. My name is Steve Siegel. I'm the Habitat Staff Specialist, and I'm going to make a small presentation on our Question 1 bond program. In 2002, the Nevadans voted and passed a $200 million bond initiative that authorized the state to sell bonds for projects to protect and preserve natural resources in Nevada. The Nevada Department of Wildlife received $27.5 million of that $200 million, and that's used for the acquisition of property to protect and manage wildlife and wildlife habitat, and to enhance recreational opportunities for Nevadans. We also use it for the development and renovation of our facilities and the improvement of existing habitats for fish and other wildlife. Following the passage of the law, the Department of Wildlife held a series of scoping meetings in, I think, 3 or 4 cities around the state to try to receive input from the public on how we should be spending that money. Department of Wildlife has created partnerships, and we leverage this money with other funding sources from the BLM, the Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Services, Restoration Federal Aid dollars, state motorboat fuel taxes, project mitigation funding from the money from the private sector, donations from sportsmen and conservation organizations, use of volunteer services, and other sources. So in front of you, you have a spreadsheet on how we have been spending our money. We've spent them, and I won't identify the numbers because you have that in front of you, but just to go through the categories, they're spent on our fish hatcheries, they're spent on habitat restorations. For instance, this year, we used about $750,000 from this fund to buy seed and do seed treatments on areas that were burned in wildfires this past year. We use it on property acquisitions, and I have a list of those properties. I anticipate a question on what acquisitions we did do. So we acquired some water rights from the Moapa Valley Irrigation Company. We purchased land called the Pier Land to add to our Overton Wildlife Management Area. The Locks Ranch also to add to our Overton Wildlife Management Area. The Kerman Tract, which is a conservation easement along the Carson River. Carson Lake water rights. The Eisenhood Deer Winter Range. There's a Newmont acquisition that went to the Humboldt Wildlife Management Area. We purchased property in the Snowstorm Mountains, the Cable property, which is adding to our Mason Valley Wildlife Management Area, and a portion of the funds that went into the purchase of the Stoll Ranch. We've created urban ponds. We're working on one in Elko. We've completed 2 in the Carson City, Gardnerville area. We've worked on the one at Crystal Peak Park, and we're looking at one right now in the Winnemucca area. We certainly use these for work at our wildlife management areas for things such as grading the roads or improving the facilities out there. We use them in our offices, and recently we used a portion of this money toward fixing the issues at our Valley Road offices, which is why we're here today. And we've also used a portion of this money for our SB 146 coordinator. That's for the Nevada Partners of Conservation and Development. So in total, we've awarded $22,291,309. We have $1,631,240 remaining. We have about $3 million in bonds that have not been sold yet, and we're waiting for Carson City to tell us that those bonds can be sold. I think they are waiting for the right time to do that. There has been some talk of the next round of question $1, but at this point, it's only been talk.
Steve, if I could, one quick correction. That SB 146 coordinator, that was a special appropriation. That was not from our Q1 allocation. So that's money we received from DCNR. So.
Okay, any questions?
Okay.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Move on to 21C, Sage-grouse update. Acting Secretary George Tsukamoto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. The Sage-grouse Ecosystem Council held its meeting earlier in the month, and I was able to be there present, and that was the first time I was exposed to it. And since then, I haven't heard or learned much about what role the Sage-grouse Ecosystem Council plays in the whole scheme of things relative to addressing the issue of sage-grouse in the state of Nevada and the possibility of listing. I have been in contact with Leo Dorsdorf of DCNR, Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, who is heading up that council for the governor's office, because this is a council established by the governor. There has yet been no funding allocated to that council. The funding mechanisms have been identified as perhaps coming from Ruby pipeline funds, mitigation funds. And there's been a question about the appropriateness of that action, especially in hiring personnel for DCNR in Winnemucca and Elko. They wanted to have a position in White Pine County as well. And the request for Ruby pipelines appeared inappropriate to do that because it was outside the Ruby pipeline area. So the BLM has recently indicated to me that their solicitors are advising them that this ecosystem council cannot use that mitigation funds for hiring of personnel. And so there's been a bit of scrambling to find out how to fund this council. We have been directed by the governor's office to find additional funds within the agency. And it would be inappropriate to use hunting, fishing, any tag sale licenses, permits, and tag sales for this kind of action. It'd be a diversion of funds. So it would have a great impact on our Pittman-Robertson actions and funding for the agency. I think the governor's office understands that. Nevertheless, they're asking for us to go ahead and find other funds if available. So we have been searching, and one of the areas that we've been looking at is perhaps mining mitigation funds to fund that. Mining mitigation funds, however, are usually associated with replacement destroyed habitat on-site or off-site. And in fact, I think there was some clause that they can do some research in as well, but limited. So there's this question about how the BLM is going to be looking at this as a partner in the Ruby mitigation funding, and where it all falls out, I don't know. It's something that's taking place at a higher level, but associated with funding that is in place in the department currently. In addition, there was a recent meeting about sage-grouse habitat mapping, and the department has already submitted a preliminary priority and general habitat map for the state of Nevada. And for whatever reason, there's some discomfort with that map that was created. So there's been a continuing meeting with the BLM and the Sage-grouse Ecosystem Council. They have invited us as a department to sit in on the conversations, but quite frankly, the governor's office is taking the lead, and we're very cautious of saying anything that may appear to be inappropriate from their direction and their how they would like to see this go. We feel that Dr. Coates of USGS has done some modeling of habitats, and so there's a desire to fund him to redo this mapping of sage-grouse habitat in the state of Nevada. We're not opposed to that from the department perspective. In fact, we think that perhaps using that model, there might be an increase in habitat. So they may be surprised at what the product might be. Or it may stay about the same. We don't know for sure, but we have no real discomfort from that approach. Recently, there was also some discussion about mine mitigation. And there was a meeting held at BLM office with the Bureau and with the DCNR. And they were discussing mitigation formulas, which was quite contrary to what currently exists in terms of mine mitigation. And I can't tell you all the very details of that. We can have Steve Siegel explain a little bit more about that. It's an ongoing thing. It's a very sensitive issue because from our viewpoint, any change in mine mitigation that has been established previously is under attack. Currently, that's my view of it. And the governor's office through the Sage-grouse Ecosystem Council is guiding that and negotiating that. We are not a part of that. So I learned today that Fish and Wildlife Service is asking why they haven't received any comment from the Department of Wildlife relative to that. And we have not gotten any permission to negotiate that at this stage. So there's going to be a reckoning day here relative to that. How do we explain to the governor what is being asked by the Fish and Wildlife Service for our participation in that meeting talking about mining mitigation. And so it's somewhat politicized here, and what the governor would come down and advise me to do, well, I'll be anxious to hear. It'll be interesting, and I think in terms of what's good for sage-grouse, from the best science approach is being attacked a little bit here. So that's about all I can say about it right now.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Drew, do you have anything to add, sitting on the Sagebrush Council?
Yeah, just to clarify a couple points. The Sagebrush Council is kind of the oversight body. We had our first meeting last month. The next meeting will be March 27th. I would imagine the mapping will be the subject of that conversation, or a key focal point in that conversation. I think everyone's trying to figure out their place in the world and how this all fits together, as Acting Director Tsukamoto has pointed out. As far as the positions go, those, I believe, are the Conservation District positions, the local coordinators that were mentioned. They aren't anything necessarily directly linked to the Oversight Council itself. But other than that, I think everyone's trying to figure out their place in the world and how all the pieces fit together and move forward from there.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, Rich Haskins, actually, there's been a BDR introduced which will describe the roles and responsibilities of the Sagebrush Council. We haven't seen the language on that yet, so we're waiting with bated breath, so we'll see.
And with that BDR, it may make it a formal body, which would then exclude Jeremy Drew from the participating when, there's good things that could come out of the BDR, but with Jeremy's background and experience and sitting on the commission, I don't look forward to that also. So, Commissioner McNitch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I have a question I'll ask in a second, but it's a really awkward situation, and I feel for the agency in that, a little bit on the outs, got all the responsibility, but really, in a lot of ways, not specifically at the table to ask those questions. So I'm hoping that they get some clarification at some part, and this commission might need to play a role. We have an interest in this as well, and through the BDR and through our legislative review processes. But just as importantly, maybe we need to consider May is going to be getting down the road a long time, and it's going to be our first best opportunity. We may need to consider some kind of it's very political, it's awkward. It's not like we haven't been in a tough spot before, and maybe this commission needs to consider drafting a letter of concern to the governor specifically, just to say, hey, we're not sure where things are going, and it'd be nice if there was. I realize things have got to play out a little bit, but we don't have time. Time's going to slip away from us if we're not careful. Talking with these